What is the attraction of Richard Mille Watches? It is a question that I have been asking myself for years and still cannot find a concrete answer. The odds of us ever owning one is small, minute even, and adding to that, would we ever buy one, even if money wasn't an object? I know my answer. But one thing that I would like this discussion to hammer home is that first impressions should not dictate your opinion on something. I want this discussion to not only look at the design and the development of these pieces, but also look at the man and the idea of what his company strives for. Without question, Richard Mille Watches are in a place now where there is no competition. But even still, there is such a paradox surrounding these pieces, and it is worth exploring. Considering my background, my interests in creating things, but now more and more my attention moving towards the design of watches, Richard Mille is a dream for someone in my position. As an innovative, creative outlet that aims at producing pieces that are technically inspired, there are zero brands that come close, and I hope to expand on this in the discussion. In all of the interviews I have seen, the man behind the watch comes across as a down-to-earth, genuine enthusiast. That is the only way for a creator to be. He loves what he has made and he loves his brand, and his enthusiasm is clearly shown in the pieces he creates. And when it comes to forming relationships with his brand ambassadors, instead of just having them as people on posters with the company logo in the background, he makes watches for them. As far as I know, Richard Mille is the only brand to do that, going to such an extreme to actually custom build a watch for their brand representatives. I mean, if that is not the coolest thing ever, I don't know what is. Let's start at the beginning. The RM001, already a clear foundation of the brand expressed through this piece. Modern, technical, relatively simple. And if you aren't aware about the ideation process that goes into creating a new product, mock-ups and prototyping is an expensive exercise, especially when dealing with something that has never been made before. And just looking at the complex curves of the case and the very distinct way the securing screws are fitted, I guarantee this process was elaborate. The amount of waste with the initial prototypes was excessive, and I'm sure the headaches caused by this watch were extreme. But since Richard trained as a watchmaker, he had learnt the traditional practice of how to create automatic movements. More than that, the outer exterior of the watch is actually inspired by a classical case design as well, something that is seldom addressed. The tonneau, in French meaning barrel, was a case shape introduced by Cartier in 1906, and immediately you can see that this design is unlike the conventional tank rectangle, square or circular styling. This shape was adopted by many popular brands at the time, and nowadays the design is reserved for very specific pieces, since they do not appeal nearly as much as they used to. But Richard Mille used the tonneau shape as the foundation for his designs, and that is pretty cool. Taking a style that is relatively outdated and converting it into a design that today is synonymous with his name. So the case shape is a reinterpretation of the classic approach, and then we get to the meat of the watch. Richard Mille has always been inspired by the complexity of mechanics, and bases his concepts on the likes of motorcar componentry and aeroplane instrument clusters. He has a drive to bring this complexity to the forefront, and always achieves it with his watches. Before going into more detail about the outward designs of the pieces, let's look at the technology on the inside. Frankly, there is no other company that comes close to him when looking at movements. Not so much from an artisanal point of view, but purely from a technology-focused point of view. There is such a variation between calibers, but what is more fascinating is how the cases have been made to adopt them. Very much like how modern cars build their body structures around the components, so too do the structures of the case allow for the integration of the movements in a very interesting way. When we talk about Incablock, Etashock, and Paraflex absorbers, these are all instruments that have been made to protect the balance wheel from the assault of shock, which in turn affects the watch's accuracy. But what is fascinating is that Richard Mille Pieces uses this system throughout the movements, almost like how supercars incorporate carbon fiber around their engine surrounds for added rigidity. These structures are made in such a way to keep the movements so well protected that they can withstand G-forces that any normal worldly object wouldn't. This is the reason why you see these watches on the wrists of athletes, even when they are in the middle of a match or a tournament. Most watch companies do not advise that their watches are worn, especially in a sporting atmosphere, since the movements are put under such great stress. That is why you see them being put on after the game, during award ceremonies in most cases. But since the movement cages of Richard Mille watches have been so meticulously engineered, they are capable of taking the force of anything thrown at them. And most wearers use these watches with confidence. Case in point, the likes of sprinters. The reinterpretation of the mechanical watch movement is what interests me. The calibers are so technical, small, lightweight, and something so plain, but considering how advanced they are is really something. Small technological powerhouses that look like something straight out of science fiction. But the exterior of these pieces catch your attention the most, and now it's time to look at them in greater detail, focusing on one of the most popular models, the RM11. This watch has it all: a calendar, a flyback chronograph, a dial that looks like it was taken directly out of an airplane cockpit. This is a good starting point, probably the purest example of where Richard Mille Watches stand today. So the cases come in a wash of different materials and finishes, some with composite exteriors and others with gold and titanium. After looking over the case and now focusing on the dial, the first word that comes to mind is cluttered. It looks like a mess on inspection, so jammed-packed with things that your eyes don't know where to look first. What is interesting is that your eye almost always looks beyond the numerals and print on the dial and immediately focuses on the background. Only after seeing the skeletonized numerals, your eyes work their way outwards and settle on them and the hands. None of these watches are easy to read at a glance, and I would argue that it is by design. The idea of blending the foreground and the background together is visually jarring, but it does make you see the watch in its entirety first. The connoisseurs would say that it helps you appreciate what you are seeing, and for the most part, I would agree. Being able to show off such a technical machine and all of its components is not an easy feat, and being able to say that every watch you make is based on a skeletonized design is a bold move. What I do like is that the detail of the watch's elements appear like a maze, and every viewing angle offers different variety and depth. I'm sure there are Richard Mille owners who still haven't fully explored the dials completely. That is something about these pieces. They are the furthest away from being boring. Keep your eyes fixed on the dial designs as the discussion continues. Almost all of them are unique, and some inspirations added to them are really fascinating. I enjoy the method of how the watch has been constructed, and how the elements, like the crown and the pushes, communicate in a similar way. They all look like elements taken from performance machines, and that is how I would describe these watches. They communicate the idea of being a performance instrument. Whether you look at them from the outside, looking at them mechanically, or looking at their individual elements, they all scream the word performance. There is so much advancement with these watches on all fronts that simply sitting back and calling them ugly is naive. And that is why I wanted to begin by talking through the inspiration behind these pieces before being more critical. Personally, I do not outwardly dislike these watches, and I don't believe you should either. As I'm sure you can tell, I admire anything that pushes the envelope in the creative space. But by also advancing the technology behind it, it's worth a grain of appreciation at least. These watches appeal to the child in me. For years, easily over a decade, I was addicted to Technic Lego. I'm sure some of you grew up with the likes of Meccano as well. The whole concept of turning plastic and metal parts into masterpieces made us all technically minded as children. My fascination behind making highly technical mechanical components stemmed from working with these plastic parts. I would work for hours on the floor or in the garage making entirely new parts. And ultimately, Lego made me want to become an engineer in the first place. So without it, I probably would never have pursued what I did, and I am immediately brought back to those times when looking at these watches. It is a strange thing, but that has always been in the back of my mind. The colors of the watches must also play a part, and I'll admit, some combinations do look pretty superb. But romance aside, I need to view these objects as watches. And these are not typical watches. As we have seen with practically all of the pieces already, the act of telling time comes second, next to the watch's complexity. The designer in me says complexity for the sake of complexity does not a good design make, especially if it means that the watch's core intention is being interfered with. So the primary function of the watch being an easy-to-read, time-telling device is thwarted with the majority of Richard Mille watches, with a few exceptions. Moving away from the time-telling and looking at the overall build and size of these pieces, it just seems ridiculous when you think about it. So much effort and attention has been put into making ultra-thin mechanical movements that are so advanced and competent, but then the result is ruined by putting the movement in a case that, for all intents and purposes, is large for the sake of being large, for the sake of presence. The intention being that these watches are worn outside of clothing and are not tucked under the sleeve. This is brash, not elegant. And maybe it is good for the identity of the watch, since anyone can notice what you are wearing at a glance, but in my mind it is not reflective of the craftsmanship that goes into these pieces. Of course there are exceptions again, but looking at the common pieces, they all seem to have the same characteristics. Bloated, huge proportions that make the wristwatch turn into a toy. I made a comment once about it looking like a watch that a 90s kid would wear, that would preferably hold sweets inside. It is called a gum watch. I remember because I totally had one back in the day. They were the coolest things on earth. These Richard Mille pieces really play on my nostalgia way too much. Now another area that bothers me, but this is a double-edged sword, the straps on these watches. On one hand, I understand that they are made with vulcanized rubber or a silicone polymer composite. They are comfortable, excellent for sport, and are lightweight, but they are just rubber straps. And adding to that, there are models that don't even come with that. Some come with nylon straps that use Velcro, not buckles or tangs, but Velcro, the miracle innovation of the 1950s. So a highly technical, top-of-the-line performing sports watch, opting to use a material that is nearly 60 years old, it just feels conflicting. But then it gets worse. Some models are supplied with stretch elastic, the same kind of material that you would find in your underwear. I have to critique this because it baffles me to no end. I would expect a tri-weave Kevlar strap or something out of this world to add to the complexity of the case. Just something that complements the brilliant piece of machinery. One last comment I'll make on these watches is the appearance. So many of them look cheap, and that purely has to do with the materials chosen. I look at some of the models and feel inspired to build my own version of it with a 3D printer. The composites that are used just appear too bright and reflective, almost like a thermoplastic, and that is not a good look to have, especially when talking about the price. Yes, we are now migrating to the prices of these pieces. I won't mention the numbers here, that is not my shtick, but I will just say that one of these pieces could buy you a very, very decent house. A house. That is enough to make the uninitiated have a heart attack. So with all the praise I've given these watches with regards to the technologies, groundbreaking methods of manufacture, it comes at a cost. A hefty cost. One that is so unreal that it turns people away from the brand before they have even learned anything about them. And that to me is sad. Richard Mille sits on its own pedestal and can therefore ask whatever he wants for his watches, because there aren't any other challengers in his field, and nothing dictates what the brand can or cannot do. So the insane paradox of Richard Mille watches could simply be summed up as this. The watches are remarkable, without question. They are high-performance instruments. They have been engineered down to a T, incorporating some of the best, even untold manufacturing methods around. They are entirely unique, and I would even go so far to say contemporary art. But the watches favor complexity over legibility, so their base function of being watches is lost amidst the technology that operates them. Though they cost the price of a house, to the layperson, and even to the experienced veteran, they appear bulky and cheap, and often incorporate materials such as Velcro and elastic into their builds. A hellishly expensive watch that in the end looks like something bought for a few dollars. So I would say in an example like this, that design has taken over function. And I mean, it's not a deal breaker. If you can afford one of these, you're not exactly buying one to tell the time. These watches are statements more than anything else nowadays. Finally, there is no point for a designer to praise and critique without offering suggestions. So is there anything I would do to these watches? It would probably go against Richard Mille's approach of creating watches for a select audience, but I would want to lower the price of these watches, just by a smidge. Maybe have them fall into the ballpark of 5 figures instead of 6. But on the design front, I would want to hone in on the watches being watches first. That's all. The mechanics and the components are great in the background, but they should remain there and be less prevalent in some situations. I referenced the Lange & data graph up-down lumen. This watch is a fantastic example. What it does is separate the numerals from the mechanics behind it with a transparent, dark dial. The components are there and visible, but the dial comes first. And this is an awesome contemporary look. Next, talking about size. With watches that are so large, you want them to be legible. Otherwise, what is the point of having a large watch? So I would spend more time focusing on bringing the size and the thickness of the pieces down. Looking at the overall proportions and working on creating integrated straps and bracelets that are flush and smooth with the confines of the case. Essentially, make the majority of the watches slip under the sleeve without a problem. There is not a lot needed to be done with these pieces when you think about it. Richard Mille has been able to bring the image of sport, performance, and fun into the equation, but I would want to see refinement added to that scale as well. These are the most ludicrous and paradoxical watches ever made, but even though they are loud, brash, some might even say offensive to the art of traditional watchmaking, I cannot fault them. For all the aspects that I find and criticize, they are still watches that excite me, because they push creativity and technology in the field of watchmaking further than it has ever gone before. And the truth is that we may never see such a radical change in the field of watchmaking again. Richard Mille Watches may finally be the full stop. So should you want one, am I telling you that you need to own one of these watches? They are not for everyone, and maybe that is a good thing. But after all is said and done, you can observe them as something different, and a piece of modern technology that I believe deserves your attention at the very least.